You are listening to an FCTL Media Services produced podcast, where ideas find their voice.
Well, we're back again with the Ferris Historians. We have renamed ourselves. Before, we were just the historians from Ferris State University. Now, thanks to the genius of Janet Pisani, we are now called the Four Historians of the Apocalypse. And it was so appropriate, and she worked so hard on it, we gave her the day off. So she's not going to be on the panel today. But what we're going to take a look at today is the idea of a neutral court, of an independent court system, and what can happen when we don't have one. So let's introduce ourselves again, since it's been a while since we have had our time here. But again, I want to say at the outset, this is for purely educational purposes only, and any opinions of the panelists are those of the panelists themselves and not of Ferris State University. So on my far right is...
Christian Peterson. I have a PhD in history from Ohio University, teach pretty much every type of history class, and I do my main publications in U.S. foreign policy, or U.S. in the world broadly defined, and peace history.
Hey, I'm Tracy Bush, and I got my PhD from Georgetown a long time ago. Been here 20 years, and Russian history is my specialty, but I also teach a lot of world history classes and gender classes.
I'm Gary Huey. My degree is from Washington State University a long, long time ago, and my field has been U.S. 20th century, but like most of us here, I've taught a whole variety of courses. So, shall we get started? I think, Christian, you wanted to get going on this to begin with.
Well, I'll do a pretty broad overview of the late 1700s into the 20th century. And what I'm, for lack of a better word, trying to do is emphasize how much importance that people put on having an independent court system and having judges being, for lack of a better word, a bulwark, at least in theory, to defend liberty, especially against congressional action. If you look at the way this country came together, and there's lots of ways to look at it, but take someone like John Adams. If you look at his political writings, if you look at his actions, he very much believed that what would be central to creating an American republic, at least one where people had liberty, was to have independent courts and judges appointed for life. And what's amazing about it is the Constitutional Convention in the early republic, the part of the government and the issue that got pretty much the least attention was the judicial branch and the court system, which was set up in a law that Washington signed and Congress passed in 1789, was the first attempt to create a major judicial system. But I want to drive home the point that the founders, many of them, really placed a lot of attention on having an independent judiciary that held the executive branch and even more to be more particular, Congress in check, or to protect our rights, comes from Federalist Paper 78, written by Alexander Hamilton. And I'm going to read a few quotes to really drive home these points. And just so we have context here, the Federalist Papers were written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, a guy named John Jay, who's one of these founders that no one remembers, although he was very influential and well-known at the time, wrote these essays in order to convince people to ratify the Constitution, or at least be in support of it. And they're very interesting reading. But he gets right to the point here in this document where he admits that of the three branches of government, the judiciary, as he writes, is in comparison the weakest of the three departments of power. But he goes on to explain why the judiciary branch is so necessary. And I'm going to read here what I think of the language that really drives home this point. This is what he writes as we get after the point where he admits that, at least in theory, the judiciary branch is weaker than the other two branches. but he says the complete independence of the courts of justice, particularly essential in a limited constitution. By a limited constitution, I understand one which contains certain specified expectations to the legislative authority, and he goes on to talk about the things that the Constitution outlawed, like bills of attainder, ex post facto laws, which are fancy words for legislatures just putting people in jail or passing laws after the fact to make something illegal. But he really goes on to emphasize in the language that this is necessary in order to have a limited government and a limited constitution. And then he writes that the courts were designed to be an intermediate body between the people and the legislature in order, among other things, to keep the latter within the limits of their assigned authority. So right off the bat, he is saying that independent courts, functioning courts, are necessary to protect people's liberties from congressional overreach. And he goes on to drive home this point with the language, nor does this conclusion by any means suppose a superiority of the judicial to the legislative power. It only supposes that the power of the people is superior to both. And then he goes on to emphasize what we would call today judicial review, the ability of the Supreme Court to declare certain laws unconstitutional or contrary to what the language of the Constitution is. And if you read this document, Hamilton, in his own way, tries to reinforce that it is the job of the courts to interpret the Constitution, especially the Supreme Court. And he says right here in another quote, the courts of justice are to be considered as the bulwark of a limited constitution against legislative encroachments. This consideration will afford a strong argument for the permanent tenure of judicial offices, since nothing will contribute so much to this as an independent spirit in the judges, which must be essential to the faithful performance of such an arduous duty. And so what the language here is fancy and whatnot, but what he's saying is we have to have independent judges who are not worried about getting kicked out of office because they make unpopular opinions. And ultimately, those judges will be central to protecting the liberties of people, especially from oversight from a legislature. They're not quite as worried much about the executive branch at times, and that is where you get judicial review comes from. One of the things that I think is important about this document is the fact that you can see the logic in Hamilton's argument that judicial review was there right from the beginning. And if you look at the early history of the Supreme Court, there are a couple cases in the 1790s, which I can say more about, where right from the beginning, the Supreme Court was saying that we have the right to judicial review. That's typically framed as judicial review was established by an important court case called Marbury versus Madison, which is the first example of the Supreme Court under Chief Justice John Marshall. He had a huge role in solidifying the Supreme Court and getting it up and running, but they declared a law unconstitutional, and people thought that was, but it's a logic from the Federalist Papers. It's a logic from how people interpreted it, and it's a logic from some of the cases that you have in the 1790s, like just one example, there was a federal law that taxed carriages, and the Supreme Court admitted that that's a constitutional law. And if you read that decision, their logic was we have the right to say or interpret the Constitution. So what I'm getting at here, and I know I'm going on for a little bit, is that when the Supreme Court got up and running, there was this idea that it was there to render decisions, maybe not to get too far outside of societal norms, but it was central in protecting Americans' liberty and helping establish a system under the rule of law. And when it made decisions like Dred Scott, which I can say more about, or others that were considered contrary to a lot of people's interests, bad law, outside of even by the standards of our times, very racist times, obviously slavery's legal and so on, that the court would, wouldn't do that. It would try to work within the limits of the system, still defending the idea of judicial review and so on. And when people have gone after attacking the independence of the courts, like Franklin Roosevelt did during the New Deal, he tried to overcome a Supreme Court that kept calling his major New Deal reforms legislations like the Agricultural Adjustment Act and others unconstitutional. He tried to change the composition of the court in a way that gave him the power to appoint 6 justices for every justice who was 70 or older. And even Democrats who thought Roosevelt, you're an awesome guy, thought that was going too far to challenge the independence of the courts, that it was a step away from our system of government. And why was that? It was because courts were seen as, Hamilton even writes in the language here, as a good line of defense and bulwark defending liberty from Congress when they pass laws that take too much liberty away, or over time, and as other people will talk about, when the executive branch got more and more power over time, going to make sure that presidents or the executive branch don't take away people's liberty. So that's a very broad overview. But I think it's sometimes not fully recognized is how much from the beginning, even someone like Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, saw courts, office for life, and all the other stuff that I've just talked about, of having an independent court system as central to the way our system of governments functions to protect individual liberty. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, why did you think that they ignored, maybe not ignored, but didn't say very much about the presidency?
Well, the way that it played out during the Constitutional Convention debates in early history of the Republic is the way that how should I put it? The language in the Constitution did not clearly say what the president's powers are. The language, if I remember correctly, and I'm old and I forget, the executive branch, it's vested in the president. So they wanted it to be somewhat ambiguous because their main concern, you can see this in the writings in the Federalist Papers, James Madison and others, the anti-federalists, that their main concern that was what was going to trample people's liberty was Congress. They were concerned about Congress. They weren't concerned necessarily about the executive branch going awry. And this is another point I would emphasize. You cannot emphasize this enough to understand how our country evolved. When people thought of executive power at the time, who did they have in mind? And who did they love? And who did they not worry about? Who had proven every effing time that he would use power responsibly. Who do they have in mind when they think of a executive?
Yeah. What I was going to say, too, is the people who are the originalists today, they're trying to put themselves in the mindset of the founders and what they were thinking when they wrote this document. How can they have that kind of an opinion and yet come up with this idea of the unitary executive theory, where the president is just in charge of everything in the executive branch of the government? How do they justify that based on the idea of originalism? And then changing that, because originally what you're saying there is they thought of a weaker presidency.
They thought of George Washington.
Yes, George Washington. Yes.
And what I think is interesting about this, and I'm not a legal expert by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not a legal scholar. I pay attention as best I can as a nerdy academic. But I can't remember where I read it, and I also heard it on a podcast, that there's this one anti-federalist paper that really made the argument that, at least in part, we can't judge our system of government by having George Washington in mind as our president, because George Washington's like once in a blue moon. Everybody else is going to want power. Everyone's going to try to use the system to benefit themselves at the expense of the public. Like human nature being what human nature is, we have to have a system that has checks and balances and prevents people who are not as responsible with power as George Washington. And we can't just pretend that people are going to use power responsibly. In fact, we should assume that they're not. And that's why courts are so central to the system, because when human beings act like human beings, we need to have some way of dealing with that. And they're talking about Congress as well. I mean, I can't say, the more I read, and once again, I don't want to pretend I'm a legal scholar, is how much at the beginning people were concerned about Congress being the one that was going to destroy liberty, which now, what's the word I'm looking for? To move ahead perhaps a little too quickly, everything I read now and listen to on podcasts and study, people are more worried. This is also like libertarians, right wing, left wing, beyond not liking things like the unitary theory, which is questionable theory, is the fact that Congress isn't doing more, that it's not making its preferences known. It's delegating too much authority to the executive branch, especially the regulatory agencies, that Congress should actually take more of a say in influencing laws, saying exactly how they're going to be carried out, exactly what the intent is, having more specific, clear legislation where Congress actually takes power instead of relying on the executive branch every 4 years just to decide what the meaning of the language is and implement it. Because for no other reason, what happens is people pretend that they're, going to be in power forever, and then when the next administration comes, they get rid of it. I mean, just look at the environmental laws. You go from Obama, you go to Trump, Biden, back to Trump. If it would be better for everybody if we actually were consistent with the language of Federalist 10 and Federalist 51, where everybody got through the nook and cranny, the hard give and take of coming up with laws that Congress passes, then they can't be changed as lightly as just an new executive branch coming in and just rolling over the executive whatever you want to call them, agencies, and then just starting over, that there is something to be said in having our democratic system actually go through the hard rigmarole of getting laws passed with Congress on anything from student loans to environmental policy to immigration, instead of just relying on executive branch agencies to do it. And then so that you get into that debate that actually now, like Neil Gorsuch with that case that he recently had about the tariffs, he wrote in his one of his concurrent opinions that at the end of the day, our system needs Congress to be more into the lawmaking instead of delegating or relying too much on the executive branch.
Yeah, I saw a political cartoon the other day. A couple was watching television, and the newscaster was saying something about Trump had done, and the wife turns to the husband and says something to the effect, "I bet you Congress is rolling over in its grave for what he's done." What I was wondering too about the fear of the legislature. Could that be in part because of what Parliament had been doing prior to the Revolutionary War? That I know they blamed a lot on George III, but I think it was Parliament that was doing most of the damage, and I wonder if that had some influence on their.
Well, the buzzword for our founding generation was consolidated government that was unaccountable, distant. I mean, the Federalists kept saying the U.S. Constitution system won't work because the government's too distant. Our liberties are best protected by our government that's closest to us, our local government, our state legislature. I mean, that's the whole. Madison tries to turn that around in Federalist 10 and Federalist 51 to argue that actually the United States is less of a threat. The federal government's less of a threat to your liberty because of how the factions and the interests will cancel each other out. And if you go through the process of making laws, what do you have to do to get a law passed? Even if you're going to do something on environmental policy that's going to stick over the long term, you need to make compromises. That's what the essence of democracy was, is that people are not going to get everything they want in the law. You still have to compromise to make the system work, or else you have dictatorship. You just have a dictatorship or an executive branch coming in and just saying, this is what we're going to do now. Madison didn't think that was the long-term solution, and he's not alone. He's not the only one. You have to have a system where a law is good, and this is what Gorsuch wrote in the. I'm pretty sure it's the concurrent opinion in the recent case that got
yes, it is.
shut down tariffs for Trump. That's what makes democracy work, where people get laws that they don't get everything they want, but there's something for everybody, and you have to go through the dirty stuff of that, as opposed to just thinking you can rigmarole or have Trump quote, the Emergency Economic Powers Act in order to put tariffs on everybody in the world, when that's clearly not in the law. The word tariffs is not even in that law. It's better to have that type of system, and that's what's going to make the system tick. Even someone that not a lot of people on the left, like the guy, we all know him here, Ronald Reagan, said at the end of the day, we have to compromise. He said, as long as I get, 2/3 to 75% what I want in a bill or a legislative session, to me, that's a victory. I don't need to win on everything, because in a system of freedom, not everyone's going to agree. You're going to have to make compromises. That's why he made those compromises on the bills he signed on Social Security, immigration, and so on. So I don't know. But the big rigmarole of all this is the fact that courts are central to protecting us and being that layer against the executive and congressional branch. And I think which gets lost sometimes in this is, for lack of a better word, that this was something that was from the beginning. Like, people worried about these issues from the beginning, and they're still as relevant as ever to debates about good citizenship today. And what, at the end of the day, we have examples of countries that don't have an independent court system. Like,
like Russia.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very concerning to see Project 2025 and the way that, of course, Article 1, Article 2, right? Article 1, legislature, Article 2, executive. And it appears to be an attempt to flip that, to focus on, with the unitary executive, that somehow the founders saw the executive as like the primary branch of government. And they've been affecting that through policy ever since. So, and as far as going back to the relationship, like where we came from in terms of Great Britain, I think our founders saw the future as legislature being stronger than the executive. They set it up that way at a lot of the state legislatures. So the executive did not have that power. So what we're seeing is over time, right, with the number of significant presidencies, Lincoln and Roosevelt and others, the consolidation of more power in the executive. And the question is, what's going to happen because of that eventually? And I think that's where we are today. As far as a lot of power has fallen into the hands of the president. It's just a matter of whether or not the president uses that power. So I think that's why we're having this conversation today.
Yeah, for sure.
Any connection between what's going on in Russia and what we're talking about?
Absolutely. Russia has a long history, only two periods of time when you saw real reform along the Western model. One would be when Alexander II frees the serfs and slavery for Russians. And then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, when they used the Western model truly as their model, and they govern according to it, well, except for the Tsar problem, but they govern mostly along Western lines. There were other monarchs back when the Tsar was Tsar, for a period of time. And, I've been reading Alexei Navalny's book, Patriot, and when you read it, and half of what he talks about is like this law was broken, that law. He's a trained lawyer, and he holds the Russian government accountable to the legal system until he's killed, right? So I think that's a pretty clear example of how they left their Western model in Russia to become, what we have under Putin, which is
Do you see any parallels what's happening here with what was happening in Russia? I mean, would they had a better chance if somebody other than Yeltsin had been the guy who was kind of taking over democracy?
There's also the economic side of it, and that's what brought Putin to power. The reforms were seen as failed. And even though when I was in Russia in 1991, so right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I talked with a lot of people, a lot of them even older, more conservative folks, and they all would say, I'm a Democrat. Like they were so excited about this new chapter. And they would even say to me, I know it's going to take a long time. I know it's going to take 5-10 years to actually make the transition, but I'm patient. I'll wait. Well, people weren't as patient as they said they were going to be. And they became very disappointed with all government, and they pretty much wrote it off. And I think this is the difference between us and the Russians. We feel an obligation to correct our government, to fight for our government, to fight for our ideals, to read the Federalist Papers, to read the Constitution. People carry the Constitution around in their back pocket. Liberals, conservatives, all of us do it. Whereas there, they abnegated their responsibility. They started saying, well, it's all corrupt. It's all up there. I live my life. The politicians steal. They're corrupt. And I don't want to have anything to do with it. And because they don't want to have anything to do with it, they end up with a dictator. So I think we have at least a tradition of civil society that will hold us through the crisis that we're in right now, which is one branch trying to have more power than the other two branches.
I wonder if that's the case, if maybe in this country we have those who are supporting Trump, pretty sizable proportion of the population. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of people who back in 2016 were very upset with both the Democrats and the Republicans. And I think that's why Trump appealed to people as well as Bernie Sanders. And, I think Clinton kind of took away the nomination from Bernie. I think it would have been interesting to see Bernie running against Trump to see which outsider and which methods that they were advocating to make change the people would have chosen. I'm just concerned that maybe, I don't know whether it's too late or not, but what I've been looking at in the courts, I'm not exactly happy about what I'm seeing. I looked at the statement Charles Evan Hughes when he was a governor of New York before he became a member of the Supreme Court and the Chief Justice. And again, it's who's on the court. He said, we are under a constitution, but the Constitution is what judges say it is. And if you start stacking the court, as Roosevelt wanted to do in the 30s, and I think is clearly happening now, I think you can see tremendous changes that maybe the majority of people are not supporting, but because of the court system, the changes are being made. One of the examples I had under the Roberts Court was gerrymandering, in which the Supreme Court indicated that, in fact, gerrymandering was anti-democratic. But they said there's nothing we can do about it, which was breaking decades of precedent that had been set before. And there are those who interpret this as an effort by the Supreme Court, which was stacked, and the judges have all been approved by the Federalist Society, to do away or to reduce the voting power of Black Americans. And if the Democratic Party does not have a good segment of the Black population voting for them, they're going to lose. And there's no question about that. And so I think I'm seeing the Roberts Court starting to try and do away with things that would enable the Democrats to gain power once again. You know, as I look at some of the decisions made by the court and the power that they have given to Trump, I wonder, would they have given those kinds of decisions had it been a Democrat in the White House, and to give that Democratic president the power that they have been giving to Trump. And there's one thing I was looking at in going over this, and that is the shadow docket that the Supreme Court has been using very much. And the shadow docket is cases that come before the court, and they demand immediate action. Whether in many cases what it was when a prisoner was slated for execution, he appealed, and there was going to see there obviously a direct problem for the person. They were going to suffer irreparable harm. They were going to be dead before the court could make a decision, and so they would step in and do these the shadow docket things where they would just issue a ruling. It wouldn't be the final ruling, but it would slow everything down. And they would usually not give any reason for why they made the decision that they did. But to give you an idea of how the Roberts Court is working, I think, to deny democracy, from 2003 to 2017, there had been 18 cases of the presidents during that time period where the Supreme Court had used the shadow docket to make a decision. That's 18 cases. During the Bush 2 and Obama, 16 years, there's only 8 cases that came out of the shadow docket. Under Trump, in his first term, there were 41 cases of shadow docket cases. And I think something like 80 to 90% of them favored Trump. In the first year of his second term, there had been already 25 cases that are going to blow away the 41, which was a record. And of the 25 cases that were brought in the first year, 20 of them supported Trump. And these were important cases. They were not just prisoners not wanting to be executed, but they had to do with removing temporary protective status from different individuals so they could be deported to countries from which they, like the Sudan or whatever, where they had no contacts, they didn't come from, and they allowed that to happen. Now, the cases are still working their way through the court system, but for those prisoners, they're already in these other third world countries, and they're there, and who knows if they will be brought back. Like Trump just ignoring the judge's ruling when those people were taken to El Salvador. He just didn't do anything, and the court was not there to prove to provide any assistance whatsoever. And again, you just look at the cases that I think are undermining democracy. First we had the case in which corporations were allowed, and unions, of course, were allowed to give whatever money they wanted to, declaring that corporations were human beings. And so limits placed on the amount of money that people can give were removed. And I think what was said someplace, I got it in my notes, the billionaires, in the meantime, that they have increased their gifts to politicians by 160%, because there's nothing, and they are, and as the court said, well, there's no quid pro quo. Just because you give money, you expected something from it, which I don't know what those people had been smoking when they said that, but the bottom line is that's crazy, but they went ahead and did it, knowing that it was probably going to corrupt the system. And then you have, of course, what I talked about with gerrymandering, trying to get rid of black votes. And then, of course, there was the immunity from Trump, that he could do whatever he wanted to. I cannot imagine that Supreme Court giving Biden that same kind of immunity to crimes. That, basically Trump can do whatever he wants to do and will not be held legally responsible for it, because some way or another he's going to connect that to his official acts. And I think that is very dangerous. And then, of course, there was the Shelby County versus Holder, in which they are, again, just doing all kinds of things to suppress voters that would tend to lean towards supporting the Democratic Party. And again, it's just just one thing after another that the Roberts Court has been doing. I think another thing we saw during the election campaign, when Colorado was enacting that portion of the 14th Amendment that indicated that if somebody had attempted to engage in overthrow of the government, they could not run for federal office. And they invoked that, and the Supreme Court stepped in and said, you can't do that, that only we can do that. So I think other states have been contemplating, maybe thinking of that, keeping him off the ballot. But because the Supreme Court stepped in and did that, again, you can just see one thing after another that's taking place here. I think maybe of course, they overturned Roe v. Wade. With the gerrymandering, getting back to that, at the time the case was issued, 76% of the population thought gerrymandering was absolutely a very serious problem. 69% wanted it to be made illegal. But the court went ahead and did their thing no matter what the people thought. And I'm wondering if, back to what Hamilton was thinking about, is the court was the weakest portion of the government, could it now be said that it's the most powerful of the three branches of government? Or are they turning that over to the executive?
Well, who wants to take that? I mean,
yeah, I see it as Project 2025. To get back to that again, that was the whole agenda, was giving power, and everybody's playing along with that plan. They spell it out right, clearly, which is that the support, basically, they abnegate. The courts too are in service of the executive when they agree with the executive. And that's why Congress has not been doing much either. They've been just allowing all these decrees to fly and not to stand up to the president, because that's just what they were supposed to do. It's a plan.
Yeah, I mean, they've allowed racial profiling,
right,
when it comes time to snatch immigrants off the streets. They've just been...
They're flirting with taking away women's rights. Just the SAVE Act?
Well, I mean, look at
that's an amendment to the Constitution.
Overturning the Roe v. Wade.
Right.
Again, that's, aimed at women in particular. Well, if you go back to originalism, women shouldn't have the vote. I think with originalism, they're kind of cherry-picking things that they want and ignoring The real...
They're actually ignoring all the amendments to the Constitution. That's also part of the Constitution.
Yes, exactly.
So their originalism means no amendments.
Well, how about the birthright citizenship that Trump wants to make illegal? It's the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. It's a constitutional amendment, but he thinks he can override that, and so far the court has not stopped him.
These are all good points, and I find all this stuff fascinating. But what's interesting to me on many levels is, one, there's many ways the Supreme Court's been favorable to Trump that we've seen and you've illustrated very clearly. The question is, why does so many of his supporters, including the president himself, go out of their way to go after the Supreme Court still? You heard his rhetoric after the tariffs case. But even before that, you have all these arguments against the court that the court's too powerful, even from the side that's winning. So when you talk about what branch is the most powerful in all of this, to me, the question is so complex and so multi-layered because in general, and this is coming from somebody who tries to, as much as possible, look at the big picture of this, is that in general, when we talked about the Supreme Court, what I have found talking to people of all different political views is that the Supreme Court is awesome, legitimate, as long as it makes decisions we agree with. So when Democrats get democratic decisions, they're like, F and follow the court, follow the court. When Republicans get it, follow the court. Now, a lot of Democrats don't like the direction of the court. I'm not saying they're wrong. I don't agree with a lot of the recent decisions, but now they're talking about getting laws passed in Congress to more or less the way that I understand the proposed legislation that's going to go zero places because of the Republicans are in charge. And even when they weren't in charge, you still have the filibuster and all that other stuff. But there's been talk about having Congress pass a law that would give Congress power to overturn or modify decisions of the Supreme Court when they deal with statutes, as opposed to basic constitutional principles, that they could have like an expedited process of congressional oversight that would actually oversee Supreme Court decisions. This has been proposed. I have read this in all sorts of different magazines and different journals, and actually it's people on somewhat different political sides. But in just going back, I see it over and over again. People can't take a side on the issue, just like how 50 years ago, a lot of Democrats thought we have to defend the Electoral College because they saw it as in their interest to win the next election. And now the Republicans want to defend it because they see it in the interest to defend. So we're going to have the Electoral College till the end of time, because no one sees beyond the next election in order to have fundamental reform. So when you throw all this in, it raises fundamental questions about how we deal with the courts. And I think the danger of all of this is that the court is discredited and people begin to look at the court system like Russians look at their government, that it's corrupt, it's stupid, it's F it, like we don't need to follow it. Like it's all part of a conspiracy against our liberty. Like if we have this idea that the courts can't be redeemed, that they're illegitimate, that they're terrible, then that's one step in the process of undermining our whole system of liberal democracy. And I'm gonna square this. I'm gonna get this all together. Is why I think it's so interesting about the birthright citizenship debate, because a lot of people were surprised at how many conservative justices went against Trump on the tariff issue, and the recent Supreme Court decision. But the birthright citizenship issue is a good one to think about. I mean, the case that you're talking about was a very famous case. I talk a lot about it in my class, actually. It's called U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark, who was a man of Chinese descent. He was born on American soil to Chinese immigrant parents, and he went back to China. And when he came back into the country, they wouldn't let him in because they said he wasn't a citizen. And he's like, I'm born here. I'm an American. And they said, no, you're Chinese. And that went to the Supreme Court and said, because of exactly like you said, because of the 14th Amendment, anyone born on an American soil, regardless of the status of their parents, is an American citizen. You're an American citizen. I mean, if you look at the planet, not many countries have birthright citizenship, and countries that did got rid of it a long time ago. I can't remember the exact year, but I want to say Britain and France got rid of it in the early 2000s. Other countries have gotten rid of it. The only countries that I know now that really do it are in the Western Hemisphere and so on. So why I'm mentioning this is because a lot of people think coming up, and this is why they're taking so long, because they want to give him time to prepare. There is a line of argument that I've read and I hear over and over again that the Supreme Court's going to come down like the hammer of Thor on Trump on birthright citizenship and say the Wong Kim Ark case decision was decided correctly. you can't get rid of birthright citizenship unless Congress does it. You can't just do it. This is why you get all these arguments now that if people don't like the courts, if you look at a lot of these recent decisions that a lot of people don't like, and it's not everyone, like there's really no way to defend that racial profiling one on immigration that people can, the wording was like totality of circumstances that gives ICE officials broad discretion to go after somebody clearly on racist profiling. But at the end of the day, if you give Congress more power, that they will pass laws and do certain things that will give the executive branch less discretion to do crazy things. If Congress would just, as one author said, grow a spine and actually do something. If it wants to get rid of birthright citizenship or defend birthright citizenship, you actually have to get Congress to make its decision clear as depending on the authority of executive branch officials. It could be. I mean, which is, never going to happen. It's very, very hard to amend our Constitution. And I don't even necessarily say they're right or wrong, but there is this argument is that at the end of the day, one of the reasons that the Supreme Court has become as powerful and influential and people are so worried about it, where they're not allowing people like Obama to get one more nominee in before he left office, is because it has so much say on what the executive branch does. And one of the ways, if we don't like how the court's functioning or we don't like certain things, Congress can pass laws. Congress can do a lot of things to limit the power and influence of the court if it so chooses. If you look at Hamilton writes in here even that the court, the way that the Constitution, and I don't need to tell you this, is that the discretion of how our court system's set up resides in Congress. I mean, that's how it was set up. The Judiciary Act of 1789, Judiciary Act of 1801. You could go on and on and on. The number of Supreme Court justices has changed throughout time. So what I'm getting at here is people have to find a way to our system to function where you're going to be unhappy some of the time with what the decisions are of the courts, what Congress passed, but you actually believe in the legitimacy of the system. Like the Russians did for a while. They believed that their system could be reformed and changed, that you believe in democracy. I think the worst thing that can happen because of going after the court's legitimacy or going after getting rid of all the executive branch officials is that it doesn't matter. Who gives a shit? It's all corrupt. That's when dictatorship happens. If you lose faith in the system, when norms begin to be disregarded, institutions wither, that's where you go to a dictatorship. And so I don't think we're there quite yet. But it is worrisome if you discredit courts and people think that they don't matter or they, whatever word you want to go for, then we're in trouble. But at the end of the day, no one's ever going to be fully happy with what our courts are doing. It's like your local soccer coach for the youth is never going to be happy. All the parents are never going to be happy with the coaches of their kids' soccer team or hockey team.
Yeah, I know that for a fact. I've been there, done that. Well, I think the approval rating of the Supreme Court is below 40%. Yeah. And I think some of that has to do, I don't know whether it has to do with decisions, but the corruption of Thomas and Alito accepting millions of dollars of gifts and things like that. And they're not going to do anything about it. And I think in some ways, they've carried that over to Trump with the immunity thing that
Congress has got to do something about it.
Something's got to be done. And I think that is part of it, is the fact that there is this issue of ethics in the court, and they're not doing anything about it. Now, the Supreme Court doesn't have ethics. Don't the local federal courts, regional federal courts, don't they have some kind of ethics that they have to deal with?
I honestly don't.
I don't remember that. I can't remember. But I think
they're more strict than.
I think that's part of it. I always tell my classes the only time you will ever agree completely with the government of the courts is if you live in a dictatorship and you support the dictator. And other than that, you're never going to be happy. I think it was Teddy Roosevelt talked about half a loaf is better than no loaf, kind of like what Reagan was talking about. It's going to get you there, but it's going to be piecemeal. It's not going to get everything you want at once. And I think we are an impatient people. And I do think that both parties have not really represented the average American as well as they could.
No.
And I think that has created a great deal of discontent. And Trump pays lip service to that. And of course, he doesn't do it. The tax cuts are all for the rich. the rich are getting richer and everybody else is getting poorer. And I think the Democrats feel that they have been, many of the working class have been ignored by the Democratic Party as well. And I think both parties, if they want to get out of this spiral that's leading us towards authoritarianism, they need to start being more responsive to the people. And I don't know, is there a solution to that? And one of the things I've always advocated was to have a completely publicly funded election. Get the unions out, get the rich people out. I mean, let's face it. Well, Musk gave almost $300 million to the Republicans to get them back into office. And of course, what's he rewarded with? He's the head of Doge. And he could go in and he could start getting rid of people in the government. There were people who were trying to make him follow regulations. And the only reason he got the job, $300 million.
And then there's all these little mini doges.
Yes.
Everybody likes to kind of follow the leader when it comes to that. And there's this idea that they're actually cutting waste, fraud, and abuse when they're actually cutting the regulations that keep our democracy steady. And I was also thinking about what you were, in terms of the word is oligarchy, right?
Yes.
And, I think going back to what you said about Citizens United, you are both the Americanists. Are we in a situation now where our wealthy are wealthier, that the income disparity is worse than it was during the Gilded Age?
Some would say yes, and some would say, it depends who arguments you believe. Some people would say that even with wealth inequality, the purchasing power of the average American is actually going up. There's a Swedish economist who wrote a book that tried to defend with the American wealth distribution system that people overstate the impact of wealth inequality. Some people like, what's his name, Krugman and others would disagree with that. I don't feel as if I have the economic background to fully say who's right or wrong, especially in a podcast like this. But to me, the issue is what people perceive. I mean, at the end of the day, people perceive that it's hard to buy groceries. It's hard to put gas in the car. It's life is tough. I mean, there's not the jobs that they don't like and so on. And I try when you ask all these questions, which are perfect. I mean, the questions have to be addressed about what we do about it to protect our system of government as outlined in the Constitution, Federalist Papers, is to think about the average voters, like how the people who are going to go to the polls and they elect people. And I think about my family. Now I'm not going to point out anyone in particular, but I have family members who are convinced that as the sky is blue, that the Democrats don't give a crap about them, that the Democratic Party does not care about them. They vote Trump and they know the badness of Trump. They think Trump cares more about them. They think no, I'm not saying they're right. I'm just telling you, this is a perception that has to be dealt with. They think Trump or that the Democrats care more about, instead of the average lower middle class, white American living in suburban, whatever city, Flagstaff, Arizona, we'll say, that the Democrats care more about transgender people. They care more about immigrants. They care more about minorities. They compare more about pointing out what's wrong with the U.S. rather than what's right about it. They don't care about the border. They don't care about illegal immigration. They don't care about crime. They point to cities like San Francisco or even Minneapolis, where essentially they think the criminals are running wild over them. And you can present evidence that contradicts all these views. But as we all know, perception's 9/10 of reality. So if they think that, how do you get them back? Do you get them back by telling them that they're racist and stupid, or they need to care more about basic economic issues? I think one of the big things that we have to keep in mind, but beyond the court system, is that people care just as much, if not more, about cultural issues than they do about economic issues. Like some people literally, I think, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I think literally some people care more about U.S. having stricter laws on immigration than them having more money in their pockets at the end of their, or better access to healthcare. I literally think, I have relatives, I think, that fall into this category. So so when they think the system is so corrupt or nonsensical, how do you reform it? You have to find a way, which is not easy. It's not easy. And I just read an article today that is worried that populism is getting stronger everywhere. People think populism is going down. If anything, it's getting stronger in Western Europe. Some people think that Marine Le Pen is going to be the next president. I mean, but she's got issues with she got ran into some corruption charges and so on. But that they're really fearful of what's going to happen. So how do you go about doing that, and then finding ways for the courts not to like stand in the way of it is part of the equation, the legitimacy of the courts. But how do we go about doing that? And another thing that even someone like Fareed Zakaria, who I don't know if people out there in the listening land would know who he is, but he's hardly a right-wing figure. In fact, I have a friend, I said I read Fareed Zakaria, a friend who's I guess the easiest way to describe him would be hardcore libertarian, who just is like, why can you read that, communist? Like, I mean, this is what he thought of, which is not a communist by any stretch. But Fareed Zakaria says people keep talking about the states like California, New York, Massachusetts, and all the ways that Minnesota even that they're better. But they're just like, it's almost impossible to get any new housing built in these states. Their budgets are bloated. They don't, they tax more. I mean, people don't people are moving to places they think are functioning better, and the government is actually more effective. He even wrote about this and did this in one of his CNN shows where he's comparing everyone talks about how bad government is in Texas and Florida, but a lot of people perceive it as better, more efficient. It's easier to get crap done with all the red tapes and regulations than cities like New York or states like Massachusetts. And I kind of listen to them maybe. I mean, I want to live where it's cold. I like hockey. I like the ice. I like to go out in the snow, and to me, it makes me what I am. I don't want to live. My point is, I literally, one of the reasons I met Ferris, because I refused to accept job offers below the Mason-Dixon line. I didn't want to live in the South. And at that point in my life, I'm like, I still got time, find myself. But my point about this, I was driving my son back to the East Coast, and I stopped at a Burger King in a town in upstate New York, across the border from Canada, when you go the route when you cross and you go into I-90 and so on. And this guy happened to have like the strongest Southern accent I've ever heard. And then another guy came in with a Southern accent. And he's like, "Oh, where are you from?" He's like, "I'm from Arkansas." And the other guy's from Georgia. And I'll get to the point. The guy said, we just hate living up here. He goes, "How do people live in this with this government and this system? I can't wait to get back to Arkansas. I can't wait to get back to Georgia. Like, this is just a terrible." Then he went off about how he tried to start a business in the city and they just wouldn't let him start a business in a way that he thought was acceptable. And he's like, "They don't even want me to succeed." I mean, I don't know the particulars. This guy could be wrong and just making stuff up. I don't know. But this is like getting national attention. So my point about this is, if we're going to find ways to deal with the issues of the tax on the courts, the health of our system, populism, we have to find ways to make government effective in ways that people beyond the people who are already converted, we don't have to reconvert them. We have to find people who don't think the system works to come around to our side, if I can use that term, as opposed to the side or arguments that Trump's making. You have to win them somehow. You have to deal with those types of issues.
Yeah, I think that's what I thought the 2016 election, if Bernie would have been there, would have been about people who want to change things. Again, you mentioned the cultural issues. I think in some ways those are, the Republicans have really used cultural issues, abortion,
1,000%.
Gun control, the immigrant, that kind of thing. They have used that so well, and the Democrats have not responded very well to that at all.
Well, once again, I'm not endorsing anything here, but I just want to tell you, I've read 1,000 times that might have been the most effective political ad that got Trump the election was that ad about transgender.
Yes. Yeah.
Like people keep going back to that. Like people really are like
prisoners in prison. They can have the surgeries.
Yeah, that, and what was the one about the
Kamala's for they them.
Yeah, that's exactly that's exactly
Trump
what I'm talking.
Is for you.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. That's the ad.
Yeah.
Like people are like that. Like whoever give that person a raise who came up with that. Like when people talked about why they voted for Trump in these focus groups, they pointed to ads like that over and over and over again. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm of the mentality. I mean, I think the court issue is so important because they're central to protecting citizens from what terrible things Congress can do, the executive branch can do, and that's for people in both parties. I mean, when other people, that to me, that's you all buy in. But we have to find ways to make it so people will once again believe in the system and it's effective for them. And that's to me the trick. That doesn't have quick, easy answers.
I mean, if you look at the approval ratings of Congress, of the Supreme Court, of Trump even, they're below 40% practically for all of them.
Yeah.
or they're close to that. And that, I think, is dangerous. And I think the Democrats, they don't do very well either.
No.
That I think that's the thing I'm concerned about is the questions you're raising here. How do we change the mentality? And it's going to be really hard to do that, given how I think negative people's feelings are about the country, where it's headed, and the people in charge.
Well, I don't know. I mean, you can go. We could talk about this till 2069, but like, take a country like Russia, where they kind of you had that cynicism and kind of the history of really trying to limit the influence of civil society and so on. Let's pretend in a universe that I don't know. Some people fantasize about Putin actually drops dead tomorrow. Let's say he has. I mean, I've heard that you've heard as much as anybody. Putin is going to die any minute, or he's dead, or where is Putin? Like, I mean. He's fine is usually my answer. But let's say he's dead tomorrow. Is that going to be the opening for Russia to rebuild and get back on the path of building some type of liberal democracy that's not, seeing an existential threat that Ukraine exists as a nation? I mean, how would you think about that? What would happen if he drops dead tomorrow? What would happen?
That's a very good question because he's surrounded himself by a bunch of yes folks. He's monopolized a lot of the security infrastructure, the power. There used to be folks even that would spy for us that were on the inside, and they're gone now. So I'm worried. I think about that quite a lot. The Prigozhin moment when he was marching on Moscow.
Yeah.
One thing I heard from Lilia Caserta was that people were quaking in their shoes in Moscow. Like they thought Prigozhin was going to win and that Putin was going to be gone. They really did. They thought it was the end. So that shows how fragile it is, too. Mm-hmm. That people think it's only as strong as people think it is.
Yes.
So I don't know. It's a really good question. And one thing that we have, I know you're all talking more on the federal level here with courts and executive and legislative branch, but there's also, when I get to teach U.S. history, I talk about states' rights, too, and how interesting that flips. If you have a Democrat in office, then all the Republicans, they're like states' rights, right? And the Democrats are like, too many state rights. And then it flips, and then the Democrats are like, yeah, states' rights. And that's a good sign, right? That shows that there's checks and balances. Like right now, we're very unbalanced. Yeah. Let's admit it. We have extremely dangerous unbalance here amongst our three branches of government. But we do have the states still, right? And one thing that, the states are, they have their own government and they can resist federal overreach, right? There's a word for it. It
depends upon who's in control in the states.
Well, this is true. There's some red states who have a better record of going to alternative energy than Massachusetts does. I mean, like the wind power, like out in Nebraska, they're really trying to move away to like renewable energy sources beyond going faster than some states that are blue. I mean, so that's I think the state level is important because they have because of federalism, they have the right to kind of do things that it would be hard for the federal government to outlaw.
And look at what's happening with the, what are those called? The plate they manufacture all the energy for the AI data centers.
Yeah.
Where's the resistance to the data centers? It's certainly not from Whitmer. It's not from Trump. It's local government. So it's also local government. And those people are coming. I was listening to the Daily New York Times Daily, and it was in a very conservative Indiana. And those people came to a public hearing, and a few folks talked about it being good for the economy. Some union people were like, "It's good for jobs and everything." But that started at 7 p.m, and they weren't done listening to all the testimony from residents until 5 a.m. Most of them against it, and that's how you stop things. That's where democracy it starts local.
Well, here in Mecosta County, Big Rapids Township has put a hold on that, and I think Green Township has either done that or they're thinking about doing that.
Yeah, and whether you're go Goshen or no Goshen, I mean, that was about local control as well.
Yeah. And I think the data centers, is there one down by Lowell, I think? I don't know whether that's still a go or whether that's been...
People have been organizing against it. I mean, there's been... I don't know if they were too slow. What happened in Indiana, I told you the story of people gathering together and resisting it, but the reason why they were resisting it the second time was because they went along with it the first time. they thought it was going to bring the jobs. They thought it was going to bring a lot of positives to their community, and they decided no, we were sold a bill of goods. And so when it happened again, they were more organized about resisting it. Doesn't mean that there won't be communities that are all for it, right? That's possible, and that's their choice. But they should decide, right? That's their water, that's their electricity. It's for them to decide.
We can only hope. Well, listen, we've been at this for about an hour now. Time flies when you're having fun.
It does fly.
And I think we probably should bring this one to an end because it's been about an hour here. Any last words before we sign off?
Thanks for listening.
Yes.
My last words, I can't do justice to this subject, but I just want to reinforce the connections and the importance of understanding history. And what I mean by that is the controversies now that surround Trump's invocation of the Alien Enemies Act, which was a law passed during the so-called quasi-war with France and the United States in 1798, the late 1700s, early 1800s. During that time, the presidency of John Adams. And invoking the Alien Enemies Act is how Trump got the justification to deport people that he said were in gangs from Venezuela and use it as a way to deport Americans, including, what's his name? I'm pronouncing this name, but Abreu Garcia, who was actually here legally and got deported to El Salvador when he was actually in legal residence here. My point about this is it's good to know where that came from. I mean, that law, the law at the time was put because the United States feared that France would invade or another enemy. So the Alien Enemies Act, it gives the government the broad discretion to deport people when a declared act of war, threatened or undertaken invasion, or a predatory incursion. That's the language that the Trump administration has used, predatory incursion of gangs and drugs, and go out and shoot missiles at boats in the Atlantic. But just to sum it up real quickly here, the Supreme Court has really taken steps to challenge that under the pretense of, or not the pretense is not the right word, but under the idea that people can't just be deported. They have to have a hearing. They have to have habeas corpus. They can't just, habeas corpus is the idea to bring the body before a judge. You have to, have a legal hearing. You can't just be deported because he invokes the Alien Enemies Act. That has been widely condemned. The court cases are still going to clear themselves out. But this matters. I mean, it matters to understand the history behind the Alien Enemies Act, our whole history of English constitutional law and jurisprudence, the whole idea going back to medieval England that you other professors in our department can relate to, like the Magna Carta, the English Civil War, the whole idea of equality for the law, even if you're richer and more important, that whole English ideal of having a system at least built on the premise that everyone, no matter who they are, has to be, equal before the law. I mean, all this stuff, and these are ideals they're not always lived up to, but they matter, and it's good to study and understand that, where that comes from, and it even plays out in the debates we're having today. Laws passed in 1798 still matter when we think about citizenship and rights today, and the way the court system functions in this country.
We just wonder how long it's going to take for all these cases to make their way through the court, and what kind of damage is going to be done in the meantime.
Maybe down the line we'll have to do a class if Trump actually invokes the Insurrection Act. How that's going to play, which is a law that gives the president broad authority to use federal troops to put down insurrections, domestic invasions, these types.
And will that come before the midterm elections?
Yeah, I mean, so
this is all very sad. One thing I'd like to say that's positive is that there are countries which have more direct democracies that have the money out of politics. Think of Denmark, for example. Mm-hmm. Like, it's possible.
And Greenland.
And then you have this populist, urge, which is a good thing, right? And people can actually have the government that they want to have, which is where one person, one vote, and a big corporation can't stomp on them, right?
England limits how long their elections are pretty effectively.
And I think, publicly supported elections. I think that would be, to me, one of the big answers.
In my ideal world, that will never exist. I have this idea in my mind of what if I could change the world, and it's never going to happen.
If you were a king for a day.
Well, one of the things I would do, I would require everybody to graduate from high school to show command of the arguments, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, including the Federalist Papers. Like, they would have to have some type of paper essay that proved they at least grappled with that. I would make it so literally there would be like a high school like show where people talked about and did all their stuff. Like that's what I would do in my world.
When I graduated from high school in 1964 in the state of Illinois, you had to take a Constitution test before you could graduate.
Wow.
You had to have some understanding. I don't know, Janet, but that was for me, and way back when, that you had to pass those tests. I think there was another test you had to pass as well, whether it's the history of Illinois, something you had to pass in addition to the Constitution.
Yeah, I believe it.
And that was, I think, significant.
I mean, you know this as well as anybody. I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole on this, but like during the civil rights movement, those poor segregated schools in rural Mississippi, they were teaching the students in like 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade more civics than we teach students today, even in high school. No, but I don't know how many accounts of civil rights activists you have to read that they were learning about the complexities of the Bill of Rights, Supreme Court, like in rural Mississippi schools in 1949. But my point, what I was getting at here, was like I want to be like Australia and like fine people for not voting. Like you have a system where it's the burden of you is to go and vote, and the state essentially plays a role in that, where it assumes that we want everybody to vote and penalizes. We make it hard to vote. I would have the day off. It would be the new like 4th of July party day. Go and vote. Pay a fine if you're not, and literally try to enforce it. I mean, there's nothing that I think would get people more to vote, and paying like, even if it's like $30, people would be like, my dad for sure, even in his 80s, would be like, I'm not paying the gosh darn, I don't want to swear, gosh darn government $30. I'll get in my wheelchair and go vote. I think, and Australia does that. No one calls that a socialist communist society.
No, by a long shot.
Maybe some do because they have universal health care. I don't know, but it seems to me we could find the way our system should be set up is to make it as easy possible to vote and get as many people to vote. That's why I'm convinced
early voting.
Well, the voter ID. So once again, we don't have time for this, but a lot of it behind the laws that allowed people to vote via the mail, that came from Republicans who thought they'd get more votes from old people who couldn't go to the polls and vote, like in Pennsylvania. And then when the Democrats are like, "Oh, we can help get a lot more votes too," then it's like, "Oh."
It's a bad idea now.
Yeah, no, exactly. So I'll leave it at that. But my point of it is there's ways that we can be optimistic about the way Americans are not accepting and fighting back and still believing in our system when compared to a country like Russia. I think I can take heart in that, and I'll sleep better tonight with that knowledge.
I can see why I was invited onto this panel now.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that was our long goodbye.
It was long.
So we'll see you next time. We don't know when and what topic, but we'll be back. The 4 Historians of the Apocalypse.
You are listening to an FCTL Media Services produced podcast, where ideas find their voice.